So the Old South is the South before what? What is the most important event of the 19th century? Civil War. Okay, this class ends when we have covered the Civil War and Reconstruction. But in the 19th century, the single most important event is the Civil War. So we are headed now towards the Civil War and analyzing that event in the last part of the class. In the 18th century in American history, what's the most important event? Well, the Revolution and the coming of the new nation in the constitutional era, right? So relatively easy. In the 20th century, the single most important event of the 20th century is what in American history? Be bold. World War II, thank you very much. World War II has still shaped the world in which you live. So sometimes it's helpful to analyze history from the top down like that, so you can always keep in mind what the most important events are, and thus people and such. This is another significant event, but I'm going to talk about it in a little bit different way. The Westward Movement, which brings the American people to the Pacific Coast. A huge event in American history, but not quite the equal of the Civil War. But instead of giving you all kinds of facts and figures, I'll give you a few. I'm just going to tell you a story, which is kind of the way I like to do history anyway. But the story is symbolic of the whole. Symbolic of the whole. So the Sager's Way West, the Westward Movement in American history. In the early 1840s, the blood of the American people was stirred by the thought of westward expansion. The nation was on the verge of hurdling the great American desert, the Great Plains in the middle of the country, the Rocky Mountains, and establishing itself on the green valleys of the Pacific Coast. In 1845, John Louis O'Sullivan, who was an editor of a national magazine, gave a name to the spirit of westward expansion when he wrote, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our multiplying millions." And the American people are multiplying both in terms of the birth rate, but also in terms of immigration. Manifest destiny. Manifest is obvious. Our obvious destiny. You can't have a destiny without reference to what or who. Without this, life is an accident. So manifest destiny. It is obvious what? That God has ordained this. Otherwise, life is an accident. There is no God. Manifest destiny means that God has ordained that we should move across, we being the American people, should move across the continent. That we should take the continent. For our multiplying millions and our free institutions, John O. Sullivan, Manifest Destiny, this is what most of the American people believe. It's part of that concept of American exceptionalism that I explained to you a few weeks ago. That God has a special purpose, an exceptional purpose for the American people. A kind of purpose He does not have, which is why we're exceptional, you see. And again, today the American people are divided on American exceptionalism or manifest destiny. Half the American people say, no way. And the other half said, yes, God still sees us as having a special purpose in the world. You have to decide yourself. Now, your politics will be impacted by what you decide on that question. And the picture we're looking at here is by John Gast, American Progress. And for Gast, manifest destiny sweeps aside all of the challenges. Look at the things that are in the way of the American people as they move west in Gast's great painting. And they're swept aside. At best, this notion of manifest destiny offered a moral justification to establish free and democratic institutions. That's at its best. At its worst, and there's always two sides to an issue. At its worst, it was just a flimsy rationalization for land grabbing, greed, and racism. Who were these American pioneers? Historians always want to know who were the people involved. What kind of people were they? Not specifically in terms of their names, although that's important at some level, but what kind of people were these? Most of those who went west in this great migration were American-born whites. They were born in this country, not immigrants. Always exceptions, but generally this is true. And they were generally under 40 years of age. This is not an old person's work. Grandma and grandpa usually left behind. Most of the American people were farmers, so it follows that most of those who went west, who migrated west, were farmers and would be farmers when they got there. They were going out west to find a better farm, more land. Between 1841 and 1867, some 350,000 men, women, and children migrated west. It's an enormous number. In 1869, of course, just 2 years after our date here, there was a railroad connection across the country. So if you wanted to go to San Francisco by 1869, you could take the train at that point. But up until 1869, people were either taking a sailing ship around South America and then back up the Pacific coast, and that's a very dangerous and long journey, or they were going overland by horse or wagon. Many Americans are under the misapprehension that the pioneers were moving into an open country, an unpopulated country, but that is not the case. Indians and Mexicans, not to mention the employees, French and British, of the Hudson's Bay Company, already inhabited the West. And in some places, in fairly large numbers. Rather than give you a series of facts and figures in the vein that I've just started to do, I'm going to switch gears here and tell you a story, as I suggested. I'm going to tell you the story of the journey west of one family. In many respects, the Sagers were symbolic of those who went west. Age, occupation, that I've already explained to you, the area of origin, the Midwest or the South, all typical of those who went west. Not too many people from Boston left to go out west, okay? That's the Northeast. This is Midwesterners whose family already have a tradition of moving west, and those from the South as well, moving out west. And so the Sagers were typical of those who went west. And what happened to them was typical, but hold this thought right here, don't write it down. Because if you write it down now, you'll miss the counterpoint. And the counterpoint is what is important. What was not typical was that all of these things that oftentimes happen to this or that person going west, all of these things happen to one family. And so their story is dramatic, and it tells us what can happen. But if we're not paying attention to what I've just said, we'll get the idea that it happened to everybody, and that is not the case. The Sager family. In other words, this is probably the unluckiest family in the history of the westward migration. You see what I'm saying here? Okay. Henry Sager was third-generation American, born in America. He was a farmer, so it all fits. He was a blacksmith. His wife Naomi was the daughter of a preacher. In 1831, John, the first of 7 children, was born. 7 children. A normal number for Americans in those days. Your retirement in those days was not your 401k plan. It was your sons who kept you around on the farm and took care of you when you couldn't do anything anymore. So you better have a few. Henry farmed in Ohio for several years before the desire to go west, the wanderlust, overtook him. And the family moved to Missouri in 1839. And in those 1830 years, more and more children were arriving. Those children arrived that I mentioned earlier. So you can see that Naomi, his wife, was busy. While Henry farmed, stories flickered up and down the Missouri frontier about a paradise. A paradise. The Oregon country. And you are sitting in the middle of that country. The Willamette Valley. Farmers listened rapturously to those traders and explorers who had visited the Oregon country and come back now to tell their stories. Making the men more eager to go. And yes, it was the men who wanted to go. Times were tough in the late 1830s. There was an economic depression. Remember Andrew Jackson? And the fact that the Bank of the United States was the great oppressor of the American people, and Jackson had killed the bank, which had brought on an economic collapse. And so now it's tough to make a living, tough to sell your crops. Why stay here and suffer in the United States when you can go out west, which was not the United States yet, and get away from all this misery? And so Jackson's ending of the bank had had an impact on the desire to go west and get away, start over again in the paradise of Oregon. And then in the Mississippi Valley in those days, in the summertime, the fever raged up and down this subtropical climate in the southern part of it anyway. And fever would take away people by the thousands. Fatal to many. Not to everyone, but to many. Especially the old and the very young. So get away. And so it was not difficult for a man to catch the Oregon fever. In 1843, almost 1,000 people took part in the first large migration, the so-called Great Migration. 1843. That's when the great movement over the Oregon Trail really begins. And these pioneers, once they got to Oregon, discovered that many of the stories of Oregon's wealth and the stories of Oregon's climate were, don't be shocked, exaggerations. It's human nature, right? To exaggerate. Yeah, exaggerate. Our whole culture is built on exaggeration. Our entertainment, exaggeration. Even our news has been infected by the culture of entertainment and exaggeration. It's got to be life-threatening on a daily basis. And I'm not picking out one side or the other here. They're both guilty. They're both suspect to our culture. And so, it was not summer all the time in Oregon. In fact, you are going to experience a real Oregon winter coming up in a few weeks. And after it's rained for about 3 months, the last thing you're going to want to do is step off the sidewalk onto the green grass. I don't know how many freshmen have been lost doing that over the years here at Fox, especially from California. It's like quicksand. Nevertheless, the truth was grand enough. The land was some of the most fertile land in the world. And the topsoil was several feet deep. I love to drive out across the Willamette Valley or ride my bike out across the Willamette Valley and go where the road engineers have leveled a small hill and plowed through that small hill to make the road a little bit flatter. And so the ground rises 6 or 8 feet on either side of you as you're riding. And if you look over that and you know what to look for, you see that is topsoil 6 feet deep and probably deeper. That is heaven. If you're a farmer. Any of you come from farm families? Yeah, 1 or 2, that's about right. But back at this time, it would have been 3/4 of you raising your hand, if not higher. See? So the truth. Compared to the Midwest, Oregon's winters are, oh, wow, that is so fun. I'm glad we're not in Iowa, where the snow is 2 feet deep. Just watch now, we're going to have a 2-foot snowstorm here. That will be rare. Deciding to go. The Sagers were not part of the 1843 Great Migration, but Henry moved his family to St. Joseph's, Missouri, which was one of the famous places where the people congregated to jump off onto the Oregon Trail, St. Joe. And so his plan was to head to Oregon in the spring of 1844. The next year. And at St. Joseph's that winter, Naomi was of a mixed mind about the coming journey. And the vast majority of women felt exactly the way Naomi felt. They did not want to go. And we know this because our historians, mainly women at this point, have looked at the journals and the letters and the diaries that these women kept, and they wrote down what they thought. Most women didn't want to go. They didn't want to leave their families. They knew how difficult this is like camping for 6 months across the Oregon Trail where you move the camp every day. And then when you get there, you're camping for a year. And you've got 6 kids. I know how my mom felt about camping when we were going for a week in a tent. I'm surprised she ever did it. Well, Naomi doesn't want to go. She complained of having traveled west for years from Ohio to Missouri and asked Henry if it was not time to settle down and take care of 6 kids. Well, or at the very least, Naomi said, can't we wait for another year, 1845? Maybe she's hoping that Henry will grow up in that year. It's probably how she would have said it. You see, she was pregnant again, the 7th child. And she was exhausted already. But Henry said, no, we're going in 1844, which was also typical of the male attitude at this time. A typical attitude of decision-making in the family, the typical male attitude toward pregnancy. It's no big deal. Yeah. And so they're going to go in 1844. Now, I'm probably 2 or 3 times stronger than my wife, physically. But I could no more carry a child around on my hip for more than 20 minutes than I could swim across the Atlantic Ocean. And I remember my wife doing exactly that hour after hour after hour when our kids were little, right? You know, like that. Wow, I'm glad I didn't do that. Now, I carried my child around on my shoulders, okay? I thought that was manly. And the kids loved it. And they even liked it when I grabbed one leg and kind of swung them down like this, you know, as long as I didn't drop them. But I tell you what, if I was a young father today, I would also draw the line at the whole kangaroo sack thing on the chest here. It's not manly, guys. It's not manly. I'm here to tell you. Well, think what you will. Oh, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. Henry doesn't care that Naomi is pregnant. So off they go. Preparation. One of the important decisions a man made on preparing for the trip was oxen or mules? What's going to pull the wagon? Oxen or mules? Note that horses are not the norm. Not hardy enough, not strong enough. Mules are faster. Oxen are stronger. Henry chose oxen, but Henry didn't know very much about oxen. It's not true that every American farmer has oxen or knows all about them. They don't. Women struggled with what to take, how to pack it. How many pounds of flour? How many pounds of bacon? Or was there room in the wagon for the family heirloom chest of drawers that Grandpa had made? Right. Yeah. It was not unusual to hear weeping as women made these decisions, what to take, what to leave behind. Still, the pioneers took too much. If you were to ride out after a large wagon train, you would see that the trail was littered with too much stuff. Just throw it out. It's weighing us down. Surprisingly, the groups often set out together without getting organized first. They're going into no country. Whatever law they're going to have, they take with them. And so they knew they had to organize, but usually the men were so excited about going as soon as the rains had hopefully stopped, and the ground was firm enough so that they didn't always get bogged down in the mud, that they put off organizing for a while. But eventually they would have to elect leaders and adopt some kind of laws. What do we do if somebody kills somebody? Right? They believed they were setting out to find the Garden of Eden. And early histories of Oregon oftentimes referred to Oregon as Eden. These are Christian people, and so they use their biblical metaphors. And for many of these people, this great adventure would be enjoyable, although incredibly hard work. But they would look back on it, even the women, once they had done it successfully, they would look back on it as the greatest accomplishment of their lives. For a few, it would be filled with tragedy and sorrow. Human beings being generally optimistic, think about it. This is something you need to understand if you're ever going to understand human behavior, history, or your own decision-making process, or that of your husband or your wife in the future, or your kids as they set off. Human beings are generally optimistic. Think about that. How many of you think you're going to graduate from college? Raise your hand. Why else would you be here if you didn't think that? Now, the statistics are that a third of you, if you're freshmen now, aren't. Sorry. About a third won't. Now, George Fox is dedicated to doing everything to make that number as small as possible. So if you need help, go get it. All right? But graduating from college is not easy. If it were, anybody could do it. And if everybody did it, then it wouldn't be worth squat. It's just reality. Generally optimistic. How many of you get married thinking that it's a 5-year deal? No, you're optimistic, right? Sure you are. When the child is born, the first one, how many of you think the child is going to prison? No. See, all these things, optimism. Now let me get deadly serious. How many of you, when you pull that cell phone out when you're driving, think you're going to end up in a fatal car crash? I'll tell you, the tens of thousands who have done that didn't think they were either. And they're dead. So optimism is a human characteristic. Factor it in and become wiser. And so everybody thinks they're going to be blessed. The Sagers' way west. On May 20th, 1844, the men finally decided to organize themselves. Of course, that's not going to be on the test. Don't write that down. Most of them had served in their state militias. You know, the summer soldiers. It was natural to adopt a quasi-military organization modified by a very good dose of Jacksonian democracy. We all get a vote. We're all as good as the next man, right? That's Jacksonian democracy. There's no aristocrats here amongst us who are obviously better. None of that nonsense. The men elected Cornelius Gilliam, who had military experience in the Black Hawk War as an officer. He is going to be their commanding officer. They also chose 4 lesser captains who were in charge of smaller units of the train. One of these was William Shaw, who would prove himself to be a great aid to the Sagers. William Shaw. In general, these pioneers mixed a spirit of adventure with a sense of responsibility for their families. Englishman John Minto wrote of this group, a generalization of these Americans who were going west. They were not a reading people. A prevailing notion among them was to be the most Western members of their families and to call no man master. Again, Jacksonian democracy. Heavy rain soaked the train in May. May on the plains are green, and the rains come down in great torrents. The eastern prairies flooded. The wagons bogged in mud a foot deep. And now the sojourners, the travelers, losing precious time. Worse, men, women, and children were constantly soaked. There is no Gore-Tex in these days. There's no rubber. There's no plastic. There's oil-stained canvas. The oil on there to help repel the rain, but it only repels the rain for a little while. And then the canvas soaks and rains right through. And so now everybody is wet, and you can't get out of it. And they're all wondering when the rains would stop. Henry Sager was not a very good ox driver. His daughter Catherine remembered one incident. You don't want your daughters, men, writing like this about you. I know you're not going to probably have oxen, and you're probably not going over the Oregon Trail, but still. At one point, Father was having trouble with his inexperienced oxen. She's being kind so far. It's the oxen who are inexperienced. Captain Shaw came to his aid. He lit into the oxen with stones until Father, fearing for his own safety, ran away. But the oxen quickly submitted when they found that they had someone to deal with who knew his business. And now, too, Naomi's time for birth was near. Though she had been through this 6 times, this one was difficult. The wagons had already lost too much time due to the rains. Henry could not expect the train to stop for very long should Naomi have any trouble whatsoever, nor could he afford to stay behind alone. On May 30th, the wagons reached the swollen Nahama River. During the night, Captain Shaw was called to the drenched Sager tent. And Captain Shaw then got his wife because Naomi was obviously near her time. And so Captain Shaw's wife served as midwife. And so Naomi then gave birth to her 7th child on the Oregon Trail. Soon the wagons were moving again. And Naomi, laying in the back of the wagon, was jostled back and forth as it went over the uneven prairie. All the while, she's holding the newborn baby, and she is not well. Now the train observed a day of rest on the 4th of July. The oxen grazed, the men hunted, and the women did laundry and baking. A day off. Then as dusk came on, the calm evening air carried the sounds of laughter and music. The emigrants set about their small fires as the stars came slowly out. Somebody picked up a fiddle or a banjo, perhaps a guitar, and they sang songs that bespoke of optimism and hope. And they took turns visiting one another's campfires. A few days later, the travelers saw their first buffalo on the Great Plains. This is 1844 now, and the buffalo herds are still an impressive sight. It's 30 years before the buffalo herds will be extinguished by the hunters. But hunting the great beasts at this moment would bring the train to a crisis of leadership. Colonel Gilliam and some of the other men wanted to take a few days and sit there so they could go hunting. And they didn't need the meat. They were just going to go hunting and kill the beasts and leave them on the prairie. Sport. But other men, most of the women, were appalled at simply shooting the magnificent creatures just for sport. And they were also, quite rightly, anxious about wasting time. You see, when you're crossing the prairie and going over the Oregon Trail by ox wagon or mule wagon, you've got to get across the Blue Mountains in eastern Oregon, and you've got to get across Mount Hood before the snows come very deep. And if you don't make it in time, you can be trapped in the Blues, or you can be trapped on Mount Hood in a blizzard. Or you realize when you get to Mount Hood, you can't make it, and you're stuck in the Dalles for the winter. You have got to keep going. Time is of the essence. One pioneer recorded the thoughts of many regarding the hunting of the buffalo. God, forgive us for such a waste, and save us from ignorance, as such would lead to similar results. After the second day of hunting, and yes, they did stop and they went hunting, and after the second day of it, the conflict between the two factions came to a head. And there was a vote. That's what Americans do, right? They take a vote. And Colonel Gilliam was preserved in the leadership position, but the vote was so close that Gilliam was exasperated, and so he resigned. And no one was elected to take his place. The four sub-captains just kind of ran their own shows in a little more loosely organized wagon train. Now the train continues to creep along the Platte River. And as it does, Henry Sager's wagon, unbeknownst to Henry, on one side of the wagon, on the other side from where he is, it kind of catches a little ridge that moves up gradually, and so the wagon as it goes is now beginning to rise on the right-hand side, and then if it keeps going like this, the whole thing's going to tip over. And that's exactly what happens before Henry can stop the oxen. And so the wagon is over on its side. And Naomi and most of the children were inside the wagon when this took place, and so Naomi was knocked unconscious. The children were okay. It's a great thing about children at this age, they tend to bounce pretty well. But Henry now, with the wagon tipped over, he's digging through the wagon and screaming and yelling and trying to find his kids and his wife. And of course the men were in front and were in back. They come running to try to help. And they finally get everything back upright again, put Naomi back in the wagon, and on they go. What else can they do? They still have to get over the Blues, and they have to get over Mount Hood, which are way in the distance still. 3 days after the wagon tipped over, 9-year-old Catherine Sager was riding in the front seat of the wagon, as she often did, and she'd already grown accustomed by this time to getting up into the wagon and then down from the wagon while the wagon was moving. Not going to stop for kids as they jump down or climb up into a wagon. And so now she decides to jump from the wagon seat down to the ground. It's a pretty good jump. And the key, though, of course, is to jump out from the wagon and clear yourself of the wagon, then go for a little roll and stand up and brush yourself off, and no problem. But as she jumped this time, she's wearing a dress. And the dress catches on on an axe handle that was sticking straight up near the wagon seat. And so instead of jumping clear of the wagon, her dress catches on that handle, and then she is pulled back down underneath the wagon. And then the back wheels come over one of her legs. Again, Henry can't stop it in time. And that leg is absolutely smashed. Henry, of course, gets the wagon stopped, and he runs to his daughter's side. And he can see what's happened. It's pretty obvious. And he sends for Dr. Dagan, who was in the train behind them, the part of the train behind them, several hundred feet back there, but his daughter is laying there in agony. And so Henry decides to set the leg himself. So you've got to pull it back into place. And then you've got to wrap it with a splint to hold it so that it'll heal. And this is excruciating, of course. But he does it. When the doctor arrived, he looked at the work that Henry had done, and I know what you're thinking, oh, he's botched it again, right? But no, he did it really well. There was nothing else the doctor could do. But he looked at this family now, and he could see Naomi, and that she wasn't doing well, and here's now the child with a broken leg, and so he decides to keep his wagon close to their wagon and do what he can for them. It took the Sager train 3 months to reach Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. Too long. Taking too much time. They got to get going. On August 23rd, the train entered the Broad South Pass. This is going over the Continental Divide. And things were not going well in the Sager wagon. Naomi and Catherine, of course, were helpless. And now Henry was beginning to feel the pangs of what the pioneers called mountain fever. Stubbornly, he fought the illness off and believed he had overcome it, and he probably had. It's not always fatal. And then he made a great mistake. When several buffalo passed nearby, a bunch of the men grabbed their rifles and off they ran to chase down the buffalo and shoot some more buffalo. And Henry, feeling a little bit better, he decided to grab his rifle and run on foot to chase them down as well. But this exertion exhausted him. And the fever took over. And again, Catherine wrote in her diary, it was soon apparent that he must die. Henry fought through the night, and Naomi forced herself up from her sickbed to come minister to her husband, fearful that, of course, he was about to die, and he was. At one point, he gazed at Catherine laying close by, and he said to her, "Poor child, what will become of you?" Now, a few minutes later, Captain Shaw entered the tent, and he found Henry weeping. The captain tried to comfort Henry. Now, keep in mind Henry's state of mind here. Whose decision was this? To come out west. And Henry's been worried about his wife for almost the entire trip. And now Catherine's got a broken leg. And now Henry thinks he's probably going to die. It's going to become of the whole family. Can you imagine the agony that Henry Sager now feels? Probably not quite But the attempt to do that, to get some sense of it, is to begin to understand life a little bit. And history can help you do that. It can help you. It's one of the uses of history. And so Captain Shaw is there by Henry's bedside. And he tries to comfort Henry, but he finds that Henry would not be comforted. He's worried about his wife and his family. And he pleads with Shaw, please take my family to the Whitman Mission. The only chance for the Sager family, the Whitman Mission. Near Walla Walla in southeastern Washington. It's where Marcus and Narcissa Whitman had established a Presbyterian mission for the Indians in the 1830s. Take my family to the Whitmans. Solemnly, Shaw promises that that's exactly what he will do. I will do it. And that at least helped a little. And a few minutes later, Henry Sager, 38 years old, died on the Oregon Trail. And they were far short of the earthly paradise that he had set out for. Now the men of the train took turns driving the Sager wagon. The children, of course, devastated by their father's death, and they could see their mother, and they were fearful that their mother was next. Still, they trudged on. They have no choice. Dr. Dagan now devotes most of his energies to the Sagers. Catherine wrote in her diary that her mother planned to winter at the Whitman Mission. Make it to the Whitman Mission, and we'll stop there. But you got to get over the blues before you can get to the Whitman Mission. The nights are now freezing, and the exposure gave Naomi a severe cold. Sores on her mouth appeared, the sure signs of the fatal fever. The train stopped at Fort Hall in present-day Idaho, but no one there could help Naomi. It's a trading post. Realizing that she would soon die, she gathered her children about her. She told the boys to stay together, to keep the family together. Now, what would normally happen if this happened back in Missouri or Ohio or whatever is that the kids would be parceled out amongst the relatives. One set of relatives take one or two children and they parcel them out that way. So the burden's not too great on any one family. And this was a normal occurrence. It didn't happen to everybody, but it happened. But Mrs. Sager, she wants to keep those children together if she can. And John, the oldest, he's 13. He's the man of the house now. Catherine Sager wrote of her mother's last moments. The day she died, we traveled over a very rough road. When we camped at night, one of the women came in as usual to wash her. The woman, supposing her to be asleep, washed her face and then lifted her hand to wash it and discovered only a very weak pulse. She lived but a few minutes more. Catherine's laying right there, you see, the broken leg again. And with her last breath, she said, "Oh, Henry, if you only knew how we have suffered." Man, you don't want your wife to ever say that. Henry didn't think that was the way it was going to turn out. the children. Captain Shaw and the rest of the train took care of the children just as they said they would. In letters written much later, Catherine explained, "We were all taken care of by the company. Everyone shared their bread with us." Again, Dr. Dagan drove the wagon, and John headed up the family. Now, lone riders, individual Americans going west on horseback, obviously traveling 3 or 4 times as fast. They passed the wagon train, and they were asked to convey a message to the Whitmans at the Whitman Mission that there was a wagon train with orphan children still on the trail coming their way. And would they take these kids when they got there? To let the Whitmans know. See. At the Whitman Mission, Narcissa Whitman wrote in her diary, There are more than 500 souls still in the mountains. It's late in the year, see. Among them, an orphan family of 7 children, when they heard the baby was still alive, see. Now the baby is going to die without its mother. Application has been made for us to take them, as they have not a relative in the train. What we shall do, I cannot say. We cannot see them suffer if the Lord casts them upon us. And so, when the train got to the Whitman Mission, the Sager children became part of the Whitman household, all 6 of them. 2 boys, 4 girls. And if you know a little bit of Pacific Northwest history, you know that 3 years later, the Whitman Mission was attacked by the Cayuse Indians, 1847. Marcus and Narcissa were killed by the Cayuse. John Sager, 16 years old by that time, was killed by the Cayuse. Francis Sager, little boy still, killed by the Cayuse. The 4 female children, the daughters, taken captive as almost 4 dozen other whites in that encampment were taken, mainly women and children. And they spent most of the winter as hostages amongst the Cayuse tribe. Eventually, one of the great mountain men in the Pacific Northwest and an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company negotiated the release of all of the hostages. Because in the Willamette Valley, a regiment was raised to come rescue them and to punish the Cayuse for killing the Whitmans. And that regiment was on the way. But that's another story. And so the 4 girls are rescued along with the other hostages. Summary. In the Sager story, all of the elements of the Westward Movement except one are present. The hopes of the pioneers are there. The trials of the trail are surely there. The difficulties and tragedies. The compassion of strangers. What is missing from the Sager story is the victory, the rewards of setting out for Oregon. You see, many pioneers, perhaps most, found a better life in the Oregon country. The Sagers were among the few who did not. The girls, after their rescue, after they grew up, suffered various fates, some better than others. But this is all a negative experience. I'm sure if you had told Henry Sager, well, this is going to cost you your wife or it's going to cost you one child, he'd have said no. It costs a lot more than that, doesn't it? Yeah. What the westward travelers, and now I'm not talking about the Sagers, I'm talking about the Westward Movement again. What this did accomplish was the building of a new land in the West. And the extension of the great republic, the United States, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I think for most of them, and we can't put any kind of calculation on this, but for most of the pioneers who went west, at least as good a life, if not better, than what they had, and for many, a much better life. Questions? Yes?
When you're mentioning all the elements that were present in the Sager story, you said it was full of proud, compassion, and what?
Everything but the victory, but you've got the tragedies as well, okay? Yeah, and the different kinds of tragedies. And in case you didn't miss it or didn't understand it, so one of the elements of being on the Oregon Trail that is oftentimes overemphasized is Indian attacks on the trail. But there was an Indian attack that impacted the Sagers, right? And that was the attack on the Whitman Mission that destroyed that mission. So that's there. Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes?
What was the nature of the immigrants?
A little bit louder, please.
What was the nature of the immigrants in the Westward Movement?
Their nature? So somebody help me with this. Who are the immigrants? What do they look like? Okay. White American farmers, how old are they? Less than 40 years of age, okay? So white American farmers who were born where? In the United States generally, second, third, fourth generation, things like that. And where are they generally from? Midwest or South, okay? As opposed to the Northeast. Okay. Anybody else? Good question, by the way. I think that's the kind of question to be on the test. Yeah. All right, I'll see you next time.